This is a fictionalized story. Jason Statham is portrayed in an imagined role, and the events described are not presented as real. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the kind of evening that usually disappears into memory without leaving anything behind. The sun had already dropped below the horizon, leaving the city covered in a soft blue-gray light. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the wide road. Businesses were beginning to close, and traffic was moving at a steady but manageable pace. People were heading home after long days at work. Families were finishing dinner. Delivery drivers were making their final rounds. Nothing suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. Jason Statham, portrayed here in a fictionalized role, was driving alone through a quiet part of the city after finishing a private training session. He wasn't surrounded by cameras. There was no security convoy following him. He wasn't dressed like someone looking for attention. He wore a simple dark jacket, a plain shirt, and jeans. His vehicle blended into the traffic. For the most part, he was just another driver trying to get home. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light ahead turned green. Jason continued through. A few blocks later, he noticed something in his rearview mirror. Red and blue lights. A police vehicle had pulled in behind him. Jason immediately checked his speed. He hadn't been driving aggressively. He hadn't made any sudden turns. Still, he understood what the lights meant. He calmly activated his indicator and moved toward the side of the road. The police vehicle stopped behind him. Jason put the car in park. He lowered his window. A few seconds passed. Then the officer approached. He was a man in uniform who looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s. His expression was serious, but there was something else in his face that Jason couldn't immediately identify. The officer stopped beside the window. License and registration. Jason reached for the documents. Of course. He handed them over without hesitation. The officer took them and stepped back toward his vehicle. Jason watched through the mirror. There was nothing unusual about the process. He had been stopped before. Sometimes officers checked documents. Sometimes they asked questions. Sometimes there was a simple misunderstanding. Usually the interaction ended within a few minutes. Jason expected the same thing this time. But after checking the documents, the officer returned to the window. He looked at Jason. Then he looked at the driver's license again. Then back at Jason. Something changed in his expression. The serious look disappeared. A small smile appeared. "You're Jason Statham?" Jason nodded. "Yes." The officer gave a short laugh. "Well, that's unexpected." Jason remained quiet. The officer looked toward his partner, who was still standing near the police vehicle. "You know who this is?" The second officer glanced over. He recognized Jason too.
"Yeah."
The first officer smiled again. "Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity." Jason didn't react. He had learned over the years that recognition could change an ordinary interaction very quickly. Sometimes people became friendly. Sometimes they became nervous. Sometimes they wanted photographs. And occasionally people tried to prove something. Jason wasn't sure which type of person this officer was yet. The officer handed the license back for a moment, then asked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Jason answered honestly.
"No."
The officer leaned slightly toward the window. "You were driving a little fast." Jason looked at him. "What speed was I doing?" The officer mentioned a number. Jason knew he hadn't been driving that fast. But he didn't argue. "Okay." The officer seemed surprised. "That's it." Jason nodded. "I asked why I was stopped. You told me." The officer stared at him for a moment. Then he smiled. "Most people would argue." Jason shrugged. "Arguing won't change what happened." The second officer looked toward his colleague. Something about the interaction already felt different. The first officer, however, seemed amused. Maybe he had expected Jason to behave like the tough characters associated with his movies. Maybe he expected an attitude. Maybe he wanted to see whether the famous action star would act like an action star when confronted by a police officer. Whatever his reason, the officer wasn't finished. "So," he said, "is this where you tell me you're some kind of tough guy?" Jason gave him a neutral look.
"No."
The officer laughed. "I've seen your movies." Jason didn't answer. "You always play the guy who walks into a room and scares everyone." Jason smiled slightly. That's acting. The second officer looked down, almost trying not to react. The first officer laughed again. Right. He paused. Because for a second, I thought maybe you actually believed you were that guy. Jason looked at him. I don't. There was no anger in his voice. No sarcasm. No challenge. Just a simple answer. The officer seemed disappointed. He had tried to provoke a reaction. He didn't get one. The road continued moving around them. Cars passed in the distance. A pedestrian waiting at a nearby corner glanced toward the police vehicle. Everything looked normal from the outside. But inside the stopped car, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The officer looked at Jason's documents again. Where are you coming from? Training. What kind of training? Private training. The officer raised an eyebrow. Private training? Jason nodded.
Yeah.
Like fighting? Jason didn't answer immediately. Something like that. The officer laughed. Of course. He looked back toward his partner. Imagine getting pulled over by the guy from all those action movies. The second officer finally spoke. Let's just finish the stop. The first officer glanced at him. We're fine. His partner didn't respond. Jason noticed the exchange. He could tell the second officer wasn't comfortable with the direction things were taking. Jason wasn't interested in making the situation worse. He simply wanted to understand why he had been stopped. So he asked, Is there anything else you need from me? The officer looked at him. Not yet. Jason nodded. Okay. The officer stepped back. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Then the officer returned. This time, there was a different tone in his voice. You know, I've always wondered something. Jason waited. What would happen if someone actually tried to challenge you? Jason looked at him. I don't know. The officer smiled. You don't?
No.
Why not? Because I don't spend my time wondering what other people might do. The officer laughed. You really are serious, aren't you? Jason shrugged. I don't know what you mean. The officer leaned closer. I'm saying you're supposed to be some kind of tough guy. Jason looked at him calmly. I'm not here to prove anything. That sentence should have ended the conversation. It should have reminded the officer that this was a traffic stop, not a competition. Instead, something about Jason's calmness seemed to irritate him. Maybe the officer felt he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. Maybe he interpreted Jason's silence as arrogance. Whatever the reason, his tone became sharper. Listen, movie star. Your reputation doesn't mean anything out here. Jason nodded. I agree. The officer paused. What? I said I agree. The officer frowned. You agree? Yes. Jason continued calmly. I'm just another driver. For a moment, the officer didn't know what to say. Jason had removed the entire argument. There was no celebrity privilege, no claim of importance, no demand for special treatment, just a driver cooperating with a police officer. The second officer watched carefully. He could sense that the conversation was becoming unnecessary. He stepped closer. Let's just check everything and let him go. The first officer looked annoyed. I know how to do my job. The second officer stepped back. Jason remained silent. Then the first officer looked at him again. Maybe you think you're too important for a traffic stop. Jason shook his head.
No.
Then why are you so calm? Jason looked at him for a second. Because there's no reason for me to be angry. The officer stared at him. Jason continued. You asked me for my documents. I gave them to you. You asked me questions. I'm answering them. The officer didn't respond. Jason added, If there's a legitimate issue, I'll deal with it. The officer's expression tightened. And if there isn't? Jason looked directly at him. Then I'll go home. The second officer looked away. The answer was so reasonable that there was nothing to argue with. But the first officer wasn't interested in reasonable anymore. He had become focused on something else. He wanted to prove that the celebrity in front of him was no different from anyone else. Ironically, Jason had already agreed with him. Nobody was above the law. Not celebrities. Not athletes. Not politicians. Not police officers. Nobody. Jason understood that. But the officer seemed determined to turn that principle into a personal contest. He took another look at Jason's documents. Then he said, You know what I think? Jason waited. I think people like you get used to everyone treating you differently. Jason didn't answer. The officer continued. People recognize you. They ask for pictures. They tell you how great you are. Still nothing. But out here? He pointed toward the road. Out here, you're nobody special. Jason looked at him. That's fine. The officer blinked. That's fine. Yes. That's all you have to say? Jason nodded. Yes. The officer seemed almost frustrated. He had expected Jason to defend his status. Instead, Jason kept refusing to participate in the argument. The officer finally said, "You know, I thought you'd have more attitude." Jason gave him a faint smile. I don't think attitude helps during a traffic stop. The second officer couldn't help but agree. That's true. The first officer looked at his partner. Stay out of it. The second officer went quiet. Jason noticed something important. The second officer wasn't supporting the behavior. He was simply waiting for the situation to end. Jason decided not to make things difficult for him either. He looked at the first officer. Can I ask one question? The officer folded his arms. What? What exactly is the reason for the stop? The officer answered. I told you. You were speeding. Jason nodded. Okay. The officer seemed surprised again. Jason continued. If that's the reason, I'm happy to address it.
He paused.
But if the reason has changed, I'd appreciate knowing that too. The officer stared at him. The question was completely reasonable, but now it forced him to confront his own behavior. Was this really about speeding? Or had it become about Jason's identity? The officer didn't answer immediately. Jason waited. Then the officer said, Don't worry about it. Jason nodded. Okay. He didn't push further. The officer returned to his vehicle. Jason watched him through the mirror. For a few moments, everything became quiet. The second officer remained near the patrol car. He looked toward Jason. Their eyes met briefly. The second officer gave a small apologetic expression. Jason simply nodded. No words were exchanged. Across the street, something else was happening. A delivery driver had parked near a convenience store. He had noticed the police stop when he arrived. At first, he wasn't interested. Traffic stops happened all the time. But as the minutes passed, he noticed that the interaction seemed unusually tense. Then he saw the officer repeatedly leaning toward Jason's window. He couldn't hear everything from that distance, but the tone was noticeable. The delivery driver took out his phone. He started recording, not because he knew Jason, not because he wanted attention. He simply wanted to document what was happening. The phone camera captured the police vehicle. It captured Jason sitting calmly behind the wheel. It captured the officer approaching the window. And it captured several moments of the conversation. The delivery driver kept recording from a respectful distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't shout. He didn't walk toward them. He simply held the phone steady. At the same time, another pedestrian near the convenience store noticed the situation. That person also began watching. The officer had no idea. Jason had no idea. The second officer had no idea. The first officer definitely had no idea. Inside the patrol car, the officer reviewed Jason's information one more time. Everything appeared to be in order. He had no reason to keep Jason there much longer. Yet when he returned to the vehicle, he didn't immediately end the stop. Instead, he walked back to the driver's window. Jason lowered it again. The officer said, You know what? Jason waited. You're handling this surprisingly well. Jason nodded. Thank you. The officer smiled. I was expecting more. More what? Resistance. Jason shook his head. There's no reason for it. The officer leaned against the window frame. You really don't get angry? Jason looked at him. Of course I get angry. The officer smiled. See? But I decide what I do with that anger. The officer paused. Jason continued. Being angry doesn't mean you have to act angry. The second officer looked toward them. That sentence seemed to land differently. The first officer, however, laughed. That's a good movie line. Jason didn't react. Maybe. The officer shook his head. You really know how to stay in character. Jason replied. I'm not in character. The officer smiled. Sure. Jason looked at him. This is real life. The officer's smile faded slightly. Yes, it is. Jason continued. And that's why I'm taking this seriously. For a second, the officer didn't speak. The words weren't aggressive, but they carried weight. Jason wasn't threatening him. He wasn't challenging his authority. He was simply reminding him that real people were involved. The officer eventually straightened. Wait here. He walked back to the patrol vehicle. Jason remained inside his car. The second officer followed his partner. They spoke quietly. Jason couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the second officer gesturing toward the documents. A few moments later, the first officer returned. He had Jason's documents in his hand. This is your license. Jason took it. And your registration. Jason took that too. The officer said, "You're free to go." Jason nodded. Thank you. He started to close the window. Then the officer stopped him. One more thing. Jason looked at him. The officer smiled again. You should remember something. Jason waited. Your reputation doesn't protect you. Jason nodded. I know. The officer continued. Out here, you're just another person. Jason looked directly at him. Exactly. The officer seemed surprised by the answer. Jason added. And that's how it should be. Then he rolled up the window. The vehicle began moving. Jason checked his mirrors and safely merged back into traffic.
He didn't speed away.
He didn't make any dramatic gesture. He didn't even look back for long. He simply continued driving. Behind him, the police vehicle remained parked. The first officer watched Jason disappear down the road. He thought the incident was finished. He believed the worst that could happen was that someone might complain about his attitude. He didn't know about the delivery driver's phone. He didn't know about the second witness. He didn't know that the entire exchange had been captured from multiple angles. And he certainly didn't know that his own words were about to come back to him. Across the street, the delivery driver stopped recording. He looked at the video. Then he shook his head. That was unnecessary. He didn't know what he would do with the footage yet. But he knew one thing. Jason had never raised his voice. He had never threatened the officer. He had never insulted him. He had cooperated from beginning to end. And somehow, the officer had still managed to turn a simple traffic stop into something personal. The delivery driver saved the video. Then he put his phone away. He didn't realize that by doing so, he had preserved the one thing that would matter most later. The truth of what happened. Meanwhile, Jason continued down the road. He wasn't furious. He wasn't planning revenge. He wasn't thinking about social media. He wasn't thinking about headlines. He was simply thinking about how easily ordinary situations could become difficult when people stopped treating each other with respect. He had seen it before. A small disagreement could become an argument. An argument could become pride. Pride could become anger. And anger could turn a simple situation into something nobody wanted. Jason understood that the easiest moment to stop escalation was at the beginning. That's why he had stayed calm. Not because he was afraid. Not because he was trying to look tough. And not because he believed he was better than the officer. He simply knew that reacting emotionally would give the situation more power over him. As he drove, his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it briefly when he reached a safe stopping point. Nothing important. He put the phone away. The city continued moving around him. People crossed streets. Cars passed. Storefronts closed. Life went on. For Jason, the incident was already becoming yesterday's problem. For the officer, however, the night was only beginning. Back at the patrol vehicle, the second officer looked at his colleague. You didn't need to do all that. The first officer frowned. Do all what? The comments. I was joking. It didn't look like a joke. The first officer stared at him. You're making too much of it. The second officer shook his head. I don't think so. The first officer dismissed the concern. He was fine. The second officer looked down the road where Jason had disappeared. That doesn't mean it was okay. The first officer didn't answer. He got into the driver's seat. The second officer entered the passenger side. The patrol vehicle eventually pulled away. But neither of them knew that a video had already been saved. Neither knew that the person who recorded it was considering sharing it with the department. And neither knew that the officer's decision to mock Jason instead of simply completing the traffic stop would soon create a problem much larger than he could imagine. Because the next morning someone would make a phone call. Then someone would send a video. Then a supervisor would ask a very simple question. Why doesn't this footage match your report? And when that question was finally asked, the officer would realize something he had failed to understand during the stop. Jason hadn't needed to fight him. He hadn't needed to threaten him. He hadn't needed to use his fame. He had simply remained calm and allowed the officer's own behavior to speak for itself. The officer thought he had controlled the entire situation because he was the one wearing the badge. But by the end of the night, the balance had already shifted. Not because Jason had done anything dramatic. Not because anyone had been physically harmed. But because respect, professionalism, and accountability had become the real issue. And once the evidence appeared, there would be nowhere left to hide behind jokes, pride, or authority. The routine stop was over. The consequences were just beginning. The next morning, the officer arrived at the station expecting another ordinary shift. He had almost forgotten about the traffic stop. To him, it had been nothing more than an uncomfortable interaction with a famous driver who happened to be unusually calm. He had no idea that someone had recorded it. At around 9 in the morning, a supervisor asked him to come into the office. The officer walked in casually. "What's going on?" The supervisor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a phone on the desk. A video was playing. The officer recognized the scene instantly. His own patrol vehicle, Jason sitting behind the wheel, and himself standing beside the window. His expression changed. "Where did you get that?" The supervisor paused the video. "A civilian submitted it." The officer swallowed. "What exactly is the complaint?" The supervisor looked directly at him. "The complaint is that you turned a routine traffic stop into a personal confrontation." The officer immediately defended himself. "I was joking." The supervisor nodded. "That's what you said in your report?" The officer hesitated.
No.
"Why not?" "I didn't think the conversation was important." The supervisor replayed a portion of the recording. The officer heard his own voice mocking Jason's movie roles. Then came Jason's calm response. "I'm not here to prove anything." The room became silent. The supervisor leaned back. "This doesn't look like a routine stop." The officer looked uncomfortable. He was cooperative. "That isn't the issue." The supervisor pointed toward the screen. "The issue is that you kept provoking him after you had already determined there was no serious problem." The officer had no immediate response. Meanwhile, another officer who had been present during the stop was interviewed. He told the supervisor exactly what had happened. Jason had cooperated from the beginning. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't demanded special treatment. The second officer admitted that he had felt uncomfortable with the way the conversation developed. The supervisor asked, "Did Jason ever become aggressive?"
No.
"Did he refuse an instruction?"
No.
"Did he interfere with the investigation?"
No.
The supervisor nodded. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Who escalated the interaction?" The second officer looked down for a moment, then answered honestly, "My partner." That statement changed everything. By lunchtime, the department had received another recording from a second witness. Now there were 2 independent videos. Both showed the same basic sequence. Jason remained calm. The officer continued making unnecessary remarks. And when Jason asked a reasonable question about the purpose of the stop, the officer treated it like a challenge. The story could no longer be dismissed as one person's interpretation. There was evidence. There were witnesses. And Jason's behavior was clearly visible. But what surprised the department most was Jason's response. He wasn't demanding that the officer be fired. He wasn't calling reporters. He wasn't using his celebrity status to pressure anyone. When contacted for a statement, Jason simply said, "I want the facts reviewed fairly. That's all." The supervisor later repeated those words during the internal meeting. One officer shook his head. "He could make this a huge problem for us." The supervisor replied, "He could, but he isn't." That was the part that made the situation more uncomfortable. Jason had every opportunity to turn the incident into a public spectacle. Instead, he was asking for the same thing anyone should receive: A fair review. Meanwhile, the officer who had mocked him was beginning to understand the seriousness of his mistake. He had assumed Jason's calmness meant the incident didn't matter. Now he realized the opposite was true. Jason hadn't needed to argue. He had simply allowed the facts to speak. And the facts were becoming impossible to ignore. The supervisor closed the file and looked at the officer. This isn't about whether you recognize Jason Statham. The officer remained silent. This is about how you treated someone when you had authority over him. For the first time, the officer lowered his head. He had thought he was teaching a celebrity a lesson. Instead, the evidence was about to teach him one, by the afternoon. The situation had become much more serious than the officer had anticipated. What started as a routine traffic stop was now being reviewed by senior personnel inside the department. The original footage had already raised concerns, but investigators wanted to know whether the video showed the entire interaction or only part of it. So they went looking for more evidence. The first step was checking the patrol vehicle's camera system. The officer had forgotten that the vehicle had automatically recorded the stop. When the footage was pulled up, the room became quiet. The camera showed Jason approaching the side of the road calmly, signaling properly, and remaining inside his vehicle. It showed the officer walking toward him. It showed Jason handing over his documents without hesitation. And then it showed the conversation changing after the officer recognized him. There was no confusion about what happened. Jason wasn't provoking the officer. He wasn't acting aggressively. He wasn't using his celebrity status to demand special treatment. If anything, he appeared determined to keep the situation calm. One investigator paused the footage. There's the moment. Everyone looked at the screen. The officer had begun making comments about Jason's action movie image. Then Jason responded calmly. The investigator continued watching. Another officer in the room shook his head. He really didn't take the bait. The investigator nodded. That makes this worse. The officer being investigated sat across the room. He had been confident earlier. Now he looked uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to intimidate him, he said. The investigator looked at him. Then what were you trying to do? The officer paused. I was joking. The investigator pointed toward the screen. Then explain why the conversation continued after your partner told you to finish the stop. The officer didn't answer. The evidence was doing the talking for him. Later that afternoon, investigators interviewed the second officer again. This time, they asked more detailed questions. Did Jason ever threaten you?
No.
Did he refuse to cooperate?
No.
Did he become verbally aggressive?
No.
Did he ask for special treatment because of who he was? The officer shook his head.
No.
Actually, he said the opposite. The investigator looked up. What do you mean? He said he was just another driver. That detail was added to the report. It mattered, because the original officer had repeatedly suggested that Jason believed he was above ordinary rules. The footage showed the opposite. Jason had accepted the traffic stop without protest. He simply wanted the reason for it to be clear. The investigation continued. Then another unexpected detail surfaced. The department discovered that several previous complaints had been made about the same officer's communication style. None involved Jason. None had received major attention. But the complaints shared a similar pattern. People described being spoken to sarcastically during routine interactions. Some said they felt the officer was trying to embarrass them. Others said he became unnecessarily confrontational when questioned. The supervisor stared at the growing file. This isn't just about one stop anymore. The officer looked nervous. I didn't realize there were that many. The supervisor replied. That's because you never looked at them. Meanwhile, Jason was asked whether he wanted to provide an additional statement. He agreed. He arrived without cameras, assistants, or publicity. He sat down and answered every question directly. One investigator asked, "Did you feel threatened during the stop?" Jason thought for a moment. I felt the conversation was becoming unnecessary. Did you feel the officer was trying to provoke you? Jason nodded slightly. Yes. Why didn't you respond? Jason gave a simple answer. Because responding emotionally wouldn't improve anything. The investigator asked, "Did you want him disciplined?" Jason shook his head. I want the department to make that decision. He paused. I don't want special treatment because people recognize me. The investigator looked at him. Then what do you want? Jason answered, I want the same standard applied to everyone. That statement stayed with the investigator. Jason wasn't asking for revenge. He wasn't trying to destroy anyone's career. He was asking for accountability. Before leaving, Jason added one final thought. Authority works both ways. If someone has the power to stop you, that person also has a responsibility to treat you fairly. The investigator nodded. Jason stood and left. Across town, the officer was still staring at the footage. For the first time, he wasn't watching Jason. He was watching himself. And what he saw was difficult to accept. He had started to stop believing he was in complete control. Now he realized that the moment he turned professionalism into personal pride, he had lost control of the situation himself. The evidence wasn't simply proving what happened. It was showing him why it happened. And that realization was far more uncomfortable than any punishment could have been. The officer thought the worst part was over. He was wrong. By the following morning, the investigation had expanded beyond the original traffic stop. What had initially looked like a simple complaint about an officer's attitude was now being treated as a serious professional conduct issue. The department had the civilian recording. It had the patrol car footage. It had a statement from the second officer. And now investigators had discovered previous complaints describing similar behavior. The officer sat in a small meeting room while his supervisor reviewed the documents. You understand what's happening here? The supervisor asked. The officer nodded slowly. I made a mistake.
You did.
But this isn't only about the mistake anymore. The officer looked up. What does that mean? It means we're reviewing whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. The officer became defensive. I've done my job for years. No one is questioning whether you've worked hard, the supervisor replied. We're questioning how you've used your authority. The officer remained silent. He knew the distinction mattered. Still, pride made it difficult for him to accept. He believed he had simply been joking with Jason. He didn't think he had crossed a serious line. But every time the footage played, the explanation sounded weaker. Jason had been calm. The officer had been sarcastic. Jason had asked reasonable questions. The officer had treated those questions as disrespect. And when the second officer suggested ending the stop, the officer had continued the conversation. There was no way around it. The evidence was clear. Later that day, the officer encountered one of the witnesses outside the station. The witness had submitted the original video. The officer recognized him immediately. He walked over. You were the one recording that night, weren't you? The witness looked uncomfortable. Yes. The officer glanced around. I just want to understand something. What? Why did you record me? The witness answered honestly. Because the interaction seemed strange. The officer frowned. I wasn't doing anything wrong. The witness didn't argue. I just recorded what I saw. The officer took a breath. You could have misunderstood what was happening. Maybe, the witness replied. That's why I sent the video instead of making accusations. The officer stared at him. The witness continued. I figured someone should look at the actual footage and decide. Then he walked away. The officer remained standing there. The conversation bothered him because the witness hadn't insulted him. He hadn't attacked him. He had simply said the truth. The officer returned inside. Instead of accepting the situation, however, he began calling people who had been involved in the investigation. He wanted them to reconsider their statements. At first, he told himself he wasn't pressuring anyone. He was simply trying to explain his side. But his tone changed when one witness refused to alter anything. You're sure that's what you remember? Yes. You don't think you might have misunderstood?
No.
The officer sighed. Think carefully. The witness became uncomfortable. I already did. The conversation ended. Unfortunately for the officer, the department had already warned witnesses not to discuss their statements with anyone involved in the investigation. The contact itself became another issue. When investigators learned about it, they immediately documented the incident. The supervisor called the officer back into the office. What were you doing? The officer tried to explain. I was just talking to the witness. Why? I wanted to clarify something. You were instructed not to contact witnesses. I didn't threaten anyone. The supervisor looked at him. That isn't the only standard. The officer became quiet. The supervisor continued. When an investigation is active, witnesses need to feel free to speak without pressure. I wasn't trying to pressure them. Intent isn't the only thing that matters. Your position gives your words weight. The officer finally understood the problem. Even if he believed he was simply defending himself, the person on the other side could reasonably feel pressured. And that was exactly what the investigation was about. The misuse of authority didn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it sounded like a simple question. Sometimes it was a suggestion. Sometimes it was nothing more than reminding someone who had the badge. But authority carried consequences. Meanwhile, Jason had heard about the additional development. He was asked whether he wanted to respond. He declined to comment publicly. Instead, he continued with his normal schedule. During a private training session, one younger trainee asked him about the situation. "Doesn't it make you angry?" Jason paused. "Of course." The trainee looked surprised. "You don't seem angry." Jason smiled slightly. "That's because feeling something and acting on it are two different things." The trainee nodded. Jason continued. "Discipline matters most when you have every reason to lose it." The room became quiet. Jason looked around at the group. "If someone tries to provoke you, the easiest thing in the world is to react." He paused. "The harder thing is to decide what deserves your response." The trainee asked, "So, what should you do when someone abuses authority?" Jason answered, "Document the facts.
Stay calm.
Let the proper process work." He didn't mention the officer by name.
He didn't need to.
The lesson applied to everyone. Back at the department, the investigation was becoming increasingly difficult for the officer. What began with one traffic stop had now become several separate concerns. His unnecessary comments, his failure to accurately describe the interaction, his previous complaints, and now his contact with the witness. The supervisor placed the updated report in front of him. "You've made this harder than it needed to be." The officer lowered his head. "I know. You could have simply accepted responsibility." The officer didn't answer. The supervisor continued. "Instead, every time you tried to protect yourself, you created another problem." That sentence finally broke through his defenses. The officer looked at the footage one more time. Jason was still sitting calmly in the vehicle. He remembered the exact moment Jason had said, "I don't want special treatment. I want the same standard applied to everyone." The officer finally understood the irony. Jason had never tried to defeat him. He had simply refused to play the game. The officer had created the conflict. Then he had tried to control the consequences. And every attempt had made things worse. That evening, he sat alone in his patrol vehicle after his shift. The city lights reflected across the windshield. He thought about his badge. He thought about the authority that came with it. And then he remembered Jason's calm voice. Authority works both ways. For the first time, the officer understood what that really meant. Having authority didn't make him more important than the people he stopped. It made him more responsible for how he treated them. He had spent days trying to prove that Jason's fame didn't matter. But he had missed the real lesson entirely. Jason's fame wasn't the point. The point was that every person deserved professionalism. And now the officer had to face the consequences of forgetting that. The investigation was no longer simply asking what happened during the traffic stop. It was asking a much bigger question. What kind of officer did he want to become from this point forward? And the answer would determine everything that happened next. The investigation continued for several more days, and the officer's situation became increasingly difficult. But something unexpected happened. The more the department reviewed the evidence, the more it became clear that Jason had never tried to turn the incident into a personal victory. He wasn't demanding public apologies. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't calling journalists. He wasn't even discussing the officer's name. Instead, Jason had simply stepped back and allowed the proper process to work. That decision surprised several people inside the department. One senior official eventually said, if he wanted to make this public, he could have done it already. Another officer nodded. But he hasn't. Exactly. Meanwhile, the officer involved in the stop had been temporarily reassigned while the investigation continued. He wasn't behind a desk because someone wanted to embarrass him. The department simply wanted to prevent the investigation from becoming more complicated. For the first time in years, the officer found himself away from routine patrol work. And with fewer distractions, he had more time to think. He replayed the traffic stop in his mind. The flashing lights. Jason lowering the window. The documents. The jokes. The sarcasm. The moment his partner suggested ending the conversation. And Jason's calm response every time he tried to provoke him. The officer had wanted to see whether Jason was really as tough as the characters he portrayed. Instead, he had discovered something completely different. Jason's strength wasn't about intimidation. It was about control. That realization became even clearer when Jason returned to his private training routine. During one session, several younger trainees were discussing the incident. One of them asked, "Did you ever think about fighting back?" Jason looked at him. No. The trainees seemed surprised. Not even for a second? Jason shook his head. Being able to fight doesn't mean you should. The room became quiet. Jason continued. Anyone can react when they're angry. The real test is whether you can stay in control when somebody gives you a reason not to. Another trainee asked, "So you weren't afraid?" Jason smiled. Fear isn't the only reason people stay calm.
He paused.
Sometimes you stay calm because you understand the consequences of losing control. The trainees listened carefully. Jason wasn't teaching them how to win a fight. He was teaching them how to avoid unnecessary ones. He explained that strength wasn't always measured by what a person could do physically. Sometimes it was measured by what they refused to do. That lesson stayed with the group. Meanwhile, the officer's supervisor received another report. The officer had requested permission to return to regular duty eventually. Before that could happen, he was required to complete additional professional training. The supervisor told him, "This isn't punishment for the sake of punishment." The officer nodded. "I understand. You need to understand why this happened." "I do." "Then tell me." The officer took a long breath. "I confused authority with control." The supervisor waited. The officer continued. "I thought because I had the badge, I had to prove that I was in charge. And I turned a simple traffic stop into a personal challenge." The supervisor nodded. "That is much closer to the real issue." The officer looked down. "I was wrong." Those words were difficult for him, but saying them felt different this time. There was no excuse attached. No attempt to blame Jason. No attempt to blame the situation. Just responsibility. A few days later, the officer was shown the final collection of evidence. The videos. The witness statements. The previous complaints. The report. Everything was organized. The supervisor looked at him. "You still believe this was just a joke?" The officer shook his head.
No.
"What changed?" "I watched myself." The supervisor nodded. "That matters." The officer stared at the screen. "I thought I was testing him." The supervisor asked, "And what did you learn?" The officer answered quietly, "That he had more control than I did." That was the first completely honest statement he had made since the investigation began. Later that evening, the officer went home and sat alone for a long time. He thought about the badge he wore every day. For years, he had believed authority meant people should listen when he spoke. Now he was beginning to understand that authority came with another responsibility. People might obey because they had to, but they would only respect him if they believed he deserved it. That distinction stayed in his mind. The next morning, he requested another meeting with his supervisor. "I want to apologize to Jason." The supervisor looked at him. "Why?" "Because I owe him one." The supervisor nodded. "You understand that an apology doesn't erase what happened." "I know." "It doesn't automatically change the department's decision." "I know. And it doesn't mean he'll accept it." The officer nodded. "I understand that too." The supervisor agreed to pass along the request. Jason eventually heard about it. He considered the request before agreeing. He didn't want a public meeting. He didn't want cameras. He didn't want the officer humiliated. He simply wanted to hear what the man had to say. The meeting was arranged privately. When the officer entered the room, Jason was already there. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the officer finally said, "I owe you an apology." Jason nodded. The officer continued, I treated you differently because I recognized you. Then I tried to turn the stop into a test. Jason remained silent. I was disrespectful. Jason looked at him. Yes, you were. The officer lowered his head. I was wrong. Jason didn't immediately respond. The officer continued. I thought I was proving that nobody was above the law. Jason finally spoke. And you were right about that. The officer looked up. Jason continued. But that principle applies to everyone. The officer nodded. I understand now. Jason leaned back. You don't need to prove that I'm just another person. The officer waited. Treating me like everyone else means treating everyone with respect. The officer absorbed the words. Jason wasn't trying to punish him. He wasn't trying to make him feel small. He was simply explaining the lesson. The officer finally said, I wish I had understood that before. Jason replied, Understanding it now is what matters. The room became quiet. Then Jason added, But only if you actually change. The officer nodded. I will. Jason stood. Then that's where you start. There was no dramatic handshake. No celebration. No instant forgiveness. Just an uncomfortable but honest conversation. And for the officer, it was more meaningful than any punishment could have been. Because he finally understood something he had missed from the beginning. Jason's real strength wasn't that he could overpower someone. It wasn't his reputation. It wasn't his celebrity status. It wasn't even the tough image people associated with him. His real strength was his ability to remain in control when someone else wanted him to lose it. The officer had tried to provoke Jason. Jason had refused. The officer had tried to defend his pride. Jason had refused to attack it. And now, after everything, Jason had given him something far more valuable than revenge. He had given him a chance to learn. The officer walked out of the room with his head lowered. But for the first time, it wasn't because he felt defeated. It was because he finally understood what responsibility really meant. And the next time he wore the badge, he knew he would have to prove that he had learned the lesson. The private meeting with Jason stayed on the officer's mind for days. He had expected anger. He had expected criticism. Maybe even a harsh lecture. Instead, Jason had given him something much harder to face. Honesty without humiliation. The officer realized that Jason could have used the meeting to make him feel small. He could have reminded him that hundreds of people had watched the footage. He could have demanded a public apology. But he didn't. Jason simply told him that an apology only mattered if it was followed by change. Those words became impossible to ignore. A few days later, the officer returned to the department for his final review. His supervisor placed the investigation file on the desk. We've reached a decision. The officer sat quietly. The supervisor explained that the department had completed its review. There would be formal consequences for his conduct, along with additional training and closer professional oversight. The officer listened without arguing. When the explanation finished, the supervisor looked at him. Do you want to say anything? The officer took a breath. I accept it. The supervisor seemed surprised. You're not going to challenge the decision?
No.
Why? The officer thought for a moment. Because I understand why it happened. That answer showed how much had changed. A few weeks earlier, he had been searching for excuses. Now he was accepting responsibility. The supervisor nodded. Then tell me what you learned. The officer looked down at his hands. I thought authority meant people had to respect me.
He paused.
Now I understand that authority can make people obey you, but it can't make them respect you. The supervisor remained silent. The officer continued. I was more concerned with proving that I was in control than actually acting professionally. That was the lesson the investigation had been trying to teach him from the beginning. After the meeting, the officer returned to duty under the new requirements. His first traffic stop was different. He approached the vehicle calmly. Good evening. Do you know why I stopped you? The driver explained that he wasn't sure. The officer listened. He explained the reason clearly. He checked the documents. He answered the driver's questions without sarcasm. The interaction ended within minutes. As the vehicle drove away, the officer remained beside his patrol car. It had been completely ordinary, and that was exactly what he wanted. He didn't need people to be afraid of him. He didn't need to win every conversation. He simply needed to do his job correctly. Later that week, the second officer who had been present during Jason's stop approached him. "You seem different." The officer smiled. "I am." "What changed?" He answered. "I finally realized I was trying to prove something that didn't need to be proven." His colleague nodded. "You mean with Jason?" "Yes." "What did he say to you?" The officer thought about it. "He said strength is knowing what you don't need to do." His colleague smiled. "That sounds like him." Meanwhile, Jason continued with his own life. He never treated the incident as some great personal victory. When people asked him about the experience, he remained measured. He explained that difficult situations were often made worse when people allowed pride to take over. He didn't say the officer was a terrible person. He didn't say everyone in law enforcement was the same. Instead, he focused on the larger lesson.
People make mistakes.
What matters is whether they are willing to acknowledge them. One evening, Jason was asked during a private conversation whether he believed the officer deserved another chance. Jason answered, "Everyone should have the opportunity to improve."
He paused.
But improvement has to be demonstrated. That distinction mattered. Forgiveness didn't mean ignoring what happened. It meant allowing someone to become better without pretending the mistake never occurred. Months earlier, the officer had thought the worst possible outcome would be losing his reputation. Now he understood that the bigger danger had been losing his character. A badge could be replaced. A position could change. A mistake could become part of a record. But the way a person treated others revealed who they were becoming. One afternoon, the officer received a message from his supervisor. It was short. "Good work today." The officer read it twice. It meant more than he expected, not because he needed praise, but because he knew the comment represented something real. His behavior had changed. His approach had changed. His attitude had changed. And this time, nobody had forced him to change.
He had chosen to.
That evening, he remembered the night of the traffic stop again. The flashing lights. The window coming down. The moment he recognized Jason.
The jokes.
The unnecessary comments. And the calm voice answering every provocation without escalating. He finally understood why the encounter had stayed with him. Jason hadn't defeated him. Jason had simply refused to become angry. That was the part the officer had underestimated. He had assumed strength meant making another person react. But real strength could mean refusing to react at all. The officer looked at his badge before leaving work. For years, he had seen it as a symbol of authority. Now he saw it differently. It was a reminder of responsibility. And that difference changed everything. The next time someone challenged him, he wouldn't ask himself how to prove he was in control. He would ask a much better question. What response would make me worthy of the authority I've been given? That was the lesson Jason had unintentionally taught him. And it was one he knew he would carry for the rest of his career. Several months had passed since the traffic stop that had started the entire controversy. By then, the investigation was officially closed. The officer had faced formal consequences, completed additional professional training, and returned to regular duty under closer supervision. But the biggest change wasn't written in the department's paperwork. It was visible in the way he treated people. His colleagues noticed that he no longer turned routine conversations into arguments. He listened more carefully. He explained things instead of mocking people. And when someone became frustrated, he didn't immediately respond with authority. He responded with patience. One afternoon, the department held a professional meeting for its officers. The purpose was to discuss communication, public trust, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. The officer involved in Jason's traffic stop was asked to speak. He stood in front of the room. For a moment, he looked nervous. Then he began. "Several months ago, I made a mistake." The room became quiet. "I stopped someone during what should have been a routine traffic stop. When I recognized him, I allowed the situation to become personal." He didn't mention Jason's name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. "I made unnecessary comments. I treated a cooperative driver as though he needed to prove something to me." He paused. "The person I stopped remained calm." The officer looked around the room. "I didn't." That sentence carried more weight than anything else he had said. He continued. "At the time, I thought I was demonstrating authority. Looking back, I understand that I was demonstrating the opposite. Nobody interrupted. I learned that having authority doesn't mean you have to use it in every conversation. Sometimes professionalism means knowing when to stop talking, listen, and simply do your job. The supervisor watched quietly. The officer finished by saying, "People don't have to like you because you're wearing a badge, but they should be able to trust that you'll treat them fairly." The room remained silent for a moment. Then the supervisor thanked him. The meeting continued. Later that evening, the officer happened to see Jason again. It wasn't planned. They crossed paths outside a building where Jason had been attending a private training session. The officer stopped. Jason recognized him. For a second, neither man spoke. Then the officer smiled. "I wanted to thank you." Jason looked at him. "For what?" "For not making things worse." Jason gave a small nod. "You changed your behavior. That's what matters." The officer smiled. "I almost didn't." Jason looked at him. "But you did." The officer nodded. "I learned something." "What?" "That respect isn't something you can demand." Jason smiled.
No.
"You earn it." Jason nodded. "Exactly." There was no dramatic confrontation. No crowd gathered around them. No cameras. No revenge. Just two people standing quietly, reflecting on an uncomfortable moment that had ultimately produced an important lesson. The officer extended his hand. Jason shook it. Then they went their separate ways. As Jason walked away, the officer watched him for a few seconds. He remembered how the entire situation had started. One routine stop. One unnecessary comment. One attempt to provoke a reaction. And one person who refused to lose control. The officer finally understood what had made Jason's response so powerful. It wasn't that Jason had somehow defeated him. It was that Jason had never accepted the invitation to turn the encounter into a battle. He had stayed calm. He had cooperated. He had trusted the proper process. And eventually, the truth had spoken for itself. The officer looked down at his badge. It still represented authority. But now it represented something more important to him. Responsibility. He understood that a badge could make people listen. It could give someone the power to stop a vehicle, ask questions, and enforce rules. But it couldn't automatically earn respect. That had to come from character, from patience, from fairness, from knowing when to speak and when to listen, and from having enough self-control not to turn every challenge into a personal battle. The story that began with a cop mocking Jason Statham during a routine stop had ended very differently from what anyone expected. There had been no revenge. No dramatic confrontation. No attempt to destroy another person. Instead, there had been accountability. There had been reflection. And ultimately, there had been change. Jason drove away that evening without looking back. The officer returned to his duties with a different understanding of what his badge meant. And the lesson remained simple. Authority can command obedience, but character earns respect. Sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one who raises their voice. Sometimes it's the person who stays calm when everyone expects them to react. And sometimes, the moment that begins with disrespect can become the moment that teaches someone how to become better.